Tonight we're going to look at authentication. Next we're going to look at authentication, incident response, and change configuration management. Then we'll have some lab time. I think what I want to do is this lesson, do some lab time, do the next two lessons and do some lab time. We're kind of have got the weather that was in Dallas last night headed our way, and we have a little bit of a tendency to have power losses here. So I'd like to get this done in the event that there is one. I don't know exactly when it'll be here. We just had one front pass through successfully. Anyhow, authentication, and the objectives are to identify the features, uses of different authentication products and protocols, understand the use and components of network access control. This will be a Windows thing. And mobile device management, and that's a big deal lately, is what do you do with the bring your own device people. Those can become real issues on how you maintain a secure network. Troubleshoot issues with authentication and access control lists. One of the comments in the instructor manual is make sure the students know the different authentication products and where they would be used, and that's the objective number one. First thing is authentication, and this goes into the factors, but what authentication does is you prove who you are. Authentication and authorization are very similar. We authenticate, you prove who you are, and then the authorization gives you permission to use certain resources, maybe to print on a printer or get to a particular folder or file. So authentication is a big deal, and then after authentication, authorization. The factors, there are 3 factors in authentication. It can be something you know, password, PIN, something like that. Something you have, a smart card, a fob, and something you are, fingerprint, palm print, look in your eye, signature, believe it or not, and the signature is not just the shape of the letters, it's how you actually sign your name. We can have multiple factors. We talk about multi-factor or two-factor authentication. Two-factor authentication means that you use 2 of the factors, maybe a smart card and a PIN. A fingerprint reader and a PIN again, or a fingerprint reader and a smart card. If we had 2 things you know, such as a password and a PIN, it would make it more difficult, but that would still be single factor authentication. You have to have something from at least 2 of those, multi-factor when you have all 3, when you have more than 2 factors in the authentication. Single sign-on is something that is handy and dangerous at the same time. What single sign-on does is eliminate the number of passwords that you have to remember, because when you sign on, you get access to all of your resources. A number of companies, people have tried this on the internet, not without resounding success, although I think Google's having more success lately than a lot of other people are, because there's a number of sites that you can now sign in with your Google login. You can get to a lot of places. You get to all your Google resources, obviously, with a single login. Microsoft has that, had that, still trying to do that. You can get to a lot of Microsoft with your Microsoft account, but single sign-on does help out. I remember we used to have, and I was the one of the network administrators at the time, a Linux email server and a Microsoft network, an Active Directory network. And it became really difficult to convince the non-technical people that they had to have 2 passwords. They had to enter it separately. You had to log on to the Linux machine, to the Linux server, to get the email separate from the Microsoft logon. Some of them never learned how to do that. When we went to the Exchange server and they got email after they logged into their accounts at the campus, things became a lot easier, particularly with resetting passwords that didn't really need to be reset, but did because they didn't remember which password they had used in which element of the network. A cryptographic hash is a fixed length string. It says it's a one-way and it says avoids collisions. A collision is when two hashes wind up being the same thing. What I would like to do is show you what a hash looks like. And you can hash a file, you can load files, but what I'm going to try to do here, if I can get back to where I need to be. This is an online hash generator. And I've typed in Mary had a little lamb, period, and you can see the hash that it draws out here. This is the SHA one. If we did MD5, I think it's probably not going to be as good. Typically not going to be as good. SHA-256, if we use it much longer, and what many systems use for passwords is they don't actually send a password, but they use a hash of the password. As you can see, if we have 256, it's going to be a much longer string, and it's going to be much more difficult to crack. So the SHA, and then we go to MD5, and we'll hash it, much shorter string. The thing that happens here is if we change anything, and I'm just going to take the period out and look at it, ends in C342. And we do the hash again, the whole hash changes. When you download software from the internet, they may have an MD5 or a SHA-1 or 256 or whatever. They may have a hash that goes along with it. There are a number of free softwares available that once you get the file, you can hash it yourself and then compare it to the one that they posted to see if somebody has modified the file. And that's one of the big things that we use, is to ensure the signature of the file. That would be the digital signature, and also for passwords. So when we get into these things, SHA SHA is newer and has longer digest because we can go down to the 356. You can see there are a whole lot of others. What you'll typically see on the equipments that we use, that I've used in the past, is MD5 and SHA and the SHA up to the 256. So the hashing algorithm, the message digest algorithm, MDA and MD5 are the two secure hash algorithm, are the two algorithms that are used. SHA is newer. It can also have the longer hashes. SH1, as they say, was quickly released in 1995 to address the flaw in the original SHA algorithm. It uses 160-bit digest. SHA2 uses a 512-bit digest. MD5 was designed in 1990 by Ron Rivest, who is he still teaches at MIT. He's a mathematics instructor there. His class got in a bunch of trouble a couple of years ago because they found some faults in the transit authority up there. And it's one of those that when they were proving it, they got in a lot of trouble. It uses a 128-bit hash. It's not secure. It's been cracked. A number of these things have been cracked. Although the 256 pretty powerful hash. Yeah, I'll get it there. These are authentication protocols. LM authentication for Windows 9X goes back to Windows 95. It is obviously not very secure, and it does not give you a very long password. It's a challenge response authentication protocol that uses an encrypted hash of the user's password. What these things typically do, and it is susceptible to cracking. It's not a very strong. It does sends a hash of the password, and the challenge and response means that when we start up and try to log on someplace, will be us and them. If we go and we say we want to authenticate here, we want to establish a session, this thing sends a random string, and we get this random string and hash the password with a random string. Send the hash back. Since this system knows what the random string was, it can create a hash. A hash is a one-way system. You don't encrypt and decrypt your hash, and what it does is create a hash and then compares them, and if the two are the same, then you get authenticated. If they're not the same, you don't get authenticated. NTLM and NTLM version 2 are stronger than the LAN manager. They're still used for the local Windows logon. Kerberos is used, and we'll look at it in a minute. It's a quite a bit more sophisticated logon system. Kerberos is used to log on to Active Directory, but the log on to the Windows local machine that you and I use at home is still going to use NTLM or NTLM v2 actually now. They have been improved, and it's a challenge and response. Sends the challenge when we log on to someplace. Kerberos, I've heard it pronounced multiple ways, is a single sign-on authentication protocol, and it uses mutual authentication. Always a handy thing to have mutual authentication where we authenticate to the server and then the server authenticates to us. Single sign-on, don't have to remember so many passwords. It has three parts: the client, which is going to be us, the server, and the server here, we're going to have an authentication server, and then the key distribution center, which is going to send keys. And typically when they ask things like this, they'll ask which protocol uses tickets, and it's going to be Kerberos. The server and the key distribution center frequently are all on the same server, this thing called a domain controller, and we can have multiple domain controllers. So what happens when we log on, we send a request to log on here, and then we get authenticated through the authentication server, again using hashes, and it sends us back what's called a ticket granting ticket. The ticket granting ticket goes to the ticket granting server, and it gives us a session ticket. We present the session ticket to the server, and then we get access to our resources. The ticket here has a list of everything we get access to. If we weren't using Active Directory, we'd have to, and we've got multiple resources on the server, we'd have to get authenticated every time that we tried to get a new resource. So, I mean, that's the 10,000 foot view of Kerberos. There's obviously a lot more activity goes on in the service itself. Radius and TACACS are used typically for wide area authentication. What we have in these things is a remote access server, and back here's the AAA server, the authentication, authorization, and accounting is what these things stand for. We have different users on the internet trying to get to the remote access server and get to maybe get to a wireless access point. We use Radius to authenticate these things, and Radius is just simply the protocol. TACACS Plus is a Cisco thing that does the Cisco system that does the same thing. Radius stands for Remote Authentication Dial-In User Service. It was originally designed as a dial-in service. When we're trying to get now, you know, when we're trying to get someplace, we want to get access to something. We're going to have in these things, we're going to have somebody out here. We're going to have a client. And the client's where the resource actually is. The client doesn't perform the authentication. It asks the Radius server, the AAA server, to validate or authenticate the user. So the Radius server is configured with the address of the AAA server, of the authentication server, the Radius server, and there's a shared secret so that they know that each of them's here. So what would happen is these guys go across the internet and want to get remote access server wants to get access to this network. The remote access server sends a request to the Radius server, said, hey, are these guys, can you authenticate these guys? And if that's the case, it goes back and says okay, and then we get in. But the client is the service that we're trying to get access to. Typically we're going to say that we're the client, but in this case we're not the client. PAP and CHAP, Password Authentication Protocol, was one of the originals, and it's really not very good. It's plain text. We're going to send the whole thing in plain text. So they say unsophisticated authentication method developed as a part of point-to-point protocol. And remember, we talked about last night, point-to-point protocol was not secure, just like SLIP wasn't secure. But it is something that is not secure. CHAP, Challenge Handshake Authentication Protocol. This is the one that again, when we have a challenge protocol, the server sends a challenge string to the client. There's a randomly generated message which is used to the client encrypts with a hash, encrypts its password and sends it back to the server. And the server then creates a hash using the same algorithm and the same information and compares the two hashes. This thing also randomly or on occasion sends a challenge to the client to be sure that there hasn't been a session stealing. So it makes things a little more secure. It's the standard authentication for PPP, and the three-way handshakes was the challenge, the response, and the accept. The challenge, when we talked about it, sends a challenge message. The response is the hashed password, and then it accepts us, and then it sends challenges occasionally. It says the handshake is repeated during a session so that we don't use replay. And Microsoft has its own version of CHAP, which is used in some of their the next one, extensible authentication protocols. Extensible, and one of the things when Windows 2000 came out, it says it supported, and Microsoft supports extensible authentication protocols. It's not designed into it. So what we can do is use different authentication methods. EAP, Extensible Authentication Protocol, and here we're talking about IEEE 802.1x, which was designed as a wireless authentication process, but can be used to authenticate, to basically do port authentication on switches, so that you actually have to log into the system before you can get on to the network. It's designed to provide for interoperable security devices and software. Supplicant was the word I was trying to think of earlier, not clients but supplicants. And we have an authenticator and an authentication server. what that means down here is that we have the supplicant. That's us trying to get onto the wireless access point. And I put a link on the lectures page to a video on how to configure 802.1x and what it does. We say, hey, we want to log into the wireless access point. The wireless access point is the authenticator, but it doesn't have a list of users. It sends our request to the Radius server, the authentication server, which may use Active Directory database, or we may build our own database on it. The Radius server then comes back with a yay or a nay. Sends a challenge. Oh, I got that wrong, didn't I? Sends a challenge to the supplicant, and the supplicant responds to the challenge using the specified authentication method. We want to log on. We send the challenge, challenge or response, challenge here, response, and then the supplicant will now sync. We'd have a yes, yay, or a nay. The 5, the authentication provides the session key, and then we have access to the access point. Much more secure than the other methods, particularly more secure than would be a pre-shared key. The problem with pre-shared keys is the distribution and trying to keep the secret keys secret. If you just give it to one person, it's probably okay. If you give it to 2, it's gonna get out. So we have those systems. EAP, TLS, we have a number of different levels of this, I guess is the way. EAP, TLS is similar to PEEP, and PEEP is right here, Protected Extensible Authentication Protocol. The protection is that it's set up with certificates, and we have a certificate on the server that has to be on the client, so the server authenticates to the client in this thing. And it uses, there's 2 different versions of PEEP. The PEEP version 0 uses Microsoft CHAP v2, and the version 1 uses the generic token card, which is Cisco's implementation of this. PEEP supported by Microsoft. When the server authenticated to the supplicant, the user authentication, and this is right out of the book, user authentication can take place through a secure tunnel with protection against sniffing. So what this does is certificate creates a secure tunnel, encrypts as we go, so that the password, the authentication process is secure. EAP, TLS, similar process, except it uses a certificate on each of them, on both the supplicant and the authentication server. Makes it a little more secure. I'm sorry, the TTLS, tunnel transport. When you see TLS, think certificates, transport layer security. Think certificate on those things. They're both are configured. Both of them are configured with a certificate. Uses a server-side. The TTLS uses a server-side certificate to establish a protected tunnel. Then you get the user's credentials, and then it can use the inner authentication protocol, PAP and CHAP. While PEEP, you got to use Microsoft CHAP or GTC. PAP is, again, not very secure, but if we do it in a tunnel, it's not going to be as bad, I guess. Wi-Fi authentication, pre-shared key, where we tell all of our friends and neighbors what our password is, or our passphrase is to get on our wireless access point. We can also use 8021X with WPA Enterprise. When you on many access points, you have WPA Personal, which is going to be a pre-shared key. WPA Enterprise is going to support 802.1x. which would be really handy to have, except then you got to have the radius server and all that other stuff running. There are access points that have radius servers that run on them, and it's like everything else. The more you pay for it, probably the more secure it's going to be. The EAP WPA Enterprise Stronger uses multi-factor authentication and network directory authorization. That we actually get the authorization from the Active Directory server. The other way to kind of keep people off, and I say kind of keep people off, is MAC filtering. You put a list out of MAC addresses that are allowed on your wireless. That works for most people, and I've read stories about the guy that it was at an airport and they want what, $15 or whatever while you're sitting at the airport in many cases to do the wireless. And this is not endorsed, but what he did, what he appeared to have done anyway, was to set up a Wireshark session, a sniffing session, and watched for a busy MAC address. And once that MAC address stopped being busy, somebody got on their airport, he spoofed that MAC to his laptop and got on the network. So MAC filtering we cannot allow. If you do this and it's not authorized, somebody can, if they're really determined to get on, can watch the traffic on a Linux machine in promiscuous mode and find out which MAC addresses are actually getting onto the system. So it is a step, but it shouldn't be shouldn't be your only defense. Defense in depth means that we're going to have a lot of different things that we're going to use to defend our system. Defense in depth means that we start out with the perimeter defense. We got the firewall getting into the network. We divide the network into VLANs. We have filters on the filtering routers on the VLANs, and then one of the last things we're going to do is put security on the endpoints. So we're going to have endpoint security in the defense in depth. So what we want to do, physical port security here is going to be on the switch. Physical port security. If something is not supposed to be plugged into the port, take the wire out. Disable the port. Do a shutdown on the port. We can configure the ports on a switch so that it only accepts traffic from a specified MAC address. The computer, the system that's supposed to be connected to that port. That's a physical configuration. Takes a little bit of time, but once you get it, you've got some more layer 2 security. And the way security works, if you can stop it at layer 2, it never gets to layer 3, 4, 5, or 6, or 7. So we can do those things. Device control. What devices are we going to allow on our network? And that's becoming a bigger and bigger and bigger deal. This MAC address filtering and limiting, I think that's what I was talking about. The physical is that you don't connect, if it's not in use, disconnected. MAC address filtering we can do in the configuration. DHCP snooping is something that only allows DHCP addresses from specified ports on the switch, so that somebody can't put a rogue DHCP server into the network. And having done that accidentally before, doing a class, and I got on a network that I didn't know I was on, and I started giving out addresses, it shut down a whole lot of people because they got addresses that weren't routable on the network that they were on. 802.1x port-based network access control. In this one, we use the 802.1x where we're the supplicant. The switch will be the client, and then we have an authentication server running that we forward the request to, and this is on a wired network. The switch is configured for 802.1x. We try to log on. We get no traffic can go across the switch port except the negotiation traffic. So the negotiation traffic goes back and forth, and our credentials get sent to the authenticating server, and the client, the authenticator, it comes back. You say, "Yep, he's a real guy. He's real, and this is the way this machine should be authorized on the network." Then the port gets turned on. The port gets turned on, and we get an IP address. It is one that is pretty secure because systems can't do anything. The ports are actually shut down until you get authenticated, and then the port on the switch gets turned on. Network access control is kind of a cool thing. We have a policy server here, radius server, the DHCP server. Each of these plays a role in it, but what really happens here is a client tries to get onto the network and maybe get onto the network from outside the network. The policy server checks it to be sure that it's up to date, that it has an up-to-date antivirus software, that it's a fully patched machine. So it checks machines before they get on the network. If it doesn't comply with all of the NAC policy server requirements, and I put a link on how to configure a network access policy on a Windows machine, link to a video also. There are several, 4 or 5 videos if you're interested in them. But it checks this thing. If it doesn't comply, then it goes down here into, it says a captive portal, into the remediation network, separated from the corporate network where it might infect something until it meets the standards, the prescribed standards in the health policy. Once it meets those, then it actually gets put automatically onto the network that it was trying to get to. But access control checks to be sure that the systems meet certain minimum requirements before they get on to the network. This is a little hard to see, but this is a posture that says Vista and XP, and what this is going to be the health policy looking for that the firewall is enabled, virus protection is on and it's up to date, spyware protection's on and it's up to date, automatic updating, and updating is enabled and it's up to date. So it checks those things, verifies compliance against the health policy like this. Persistent versus non-persistent agents. Persistent agents are if the software is installed, if it's installed as a software application. It's non-persistent, is loaded into memory during the posture assessments, not installed on the device. The newer Microsoft operating systems, Windows Vista on up, actually have a network access control that you turn on and allows the server to check it. If you're going to do an XP machine, you have to install a client so that it actually talks to the server itself. And then remediation, we have a guest network or a quarantine network, whichever you want to call it. We have an area separated from the rest of the network where the system can be brought up to standards. The mobile device, and bring your own device, BYOD, mobile device management software, onboarding and offboarding. This has become a really big deal. The process, it says onboarding, when we allow a system to be connected to the network. Couple of the issues that you run into: application control, storage, segmentation, offboarding is taken permanently off the site, permanently removed from the organization, is who owns the device. If the individual owns the device, we don't really have a lot of say, so you may want to only give access to a small portion of the network. The last place I was, the school where I was, you could get logged in on a tablet or a phone, but you could only have access to the internet. You couldn't have access to any of the resources on the network, home directory or anything else, because you just don't know. And you can't force somebody to let you check their devices. I think that's probably one of the reasons that some companies are now providing telephones and tablets to employees that need them, because they own the device then and they can check it and see how it's being used. But storage segmentation, we probably want these things in a segmented portion. Application control, they're very difficult to control. What can you do with them? You can't really send policies to them, even if you allow them to log on to that portion of your network. Authentication and access control lists. It says confirm connectivity, establish a session, troubleshooting Windows, troubleshooting misconfigured applications. But on these things, troubleshooting authentication, confirm connectivity. What's going on with the system? Why aren't we being authenticated? And these are where some of the sniffing comes in, Wireshark and those sorts of things come in. What's not happening in the system? Troubleshooting a Windows network, you can use logs. What's available, what's not available, why aren't we getting authenticated? Do we have a firewall? Are the correct ports open? Are the ports open both ways if they need to be open both ways? Are the services available? Those are the kinds of things that we need to look at. What if the services are unavailable or not started? You may need to look in the services. You need to know which services have to be available. If the server didn't register with DNS when it's booted, it's going to be an issue with Windows. DNS is an absolute requirement for Active Directory. If the configuration isn't what it should be, the domain configuration, DHCP servers didn't allocate all of the configuration information required, what happened on these things. And again, you can see a lot of that if you sniff the network. Non-Windows, you're kind of testing the same things. Are required the name service and DHCP, are those services working? Troubleshooting VPNs, look at the logs, and there are you can look at the formation of the VPN. How far are you getting? Misconfigured applications also implement their own user authentication. Some of them do that along with the system permissions, and we see that frequently when we install applications. You want to allow it to have access to certain things. So what is and what isn't working, what ports are working. Access control permissions, domain groups and local groups. When you, and this is overview, so in Windows you may have to look at effective permissions, and you can do that with the properties of the user object. We have a number of groups. We have domain groups and local groups, and what really happens there, domain groups are the best. Well, they're really not, because local groups get access to resources. The way Windows works, domain groups, global groups, is users go into global groups go into local groups, and local groups get access to resources. Now, you don't need to know that. That's just the process that they use. When you do that, we can actually control access to the resource from Active Directory by changing the membership of the global group, because the local group is going to be where the resource is. So we can control what goes on here, the permissions. And the way Windows works, you get the permissions of every group that you have, and if you're denied even one time, you're denied for all times, and that's where effective permissions come in. Do the users actually have the permissions that we think they have? There is an effective permissions button, for lack of a better word. The Windows will actually calculate those now. Up until I think probably maybe 2008, you had to manually calculate those effective permissions. So the review, identify the features and uses of different authentication protocols, understand the use and components of the network access control and mobile device management, troubleshoot issues with access control lists. Let's do the questions, take a break, and then work on labs for about an hour, and I'll come back and do the last two, and then we'll do labs at the end. So what's the purpose of single sign-on, SSO single sign-on?
So that we can be able to have secure, so we can be more secure.
So be more secure, so only have one password.
Oh, well, yeah, so
and that actually does make it more secure because you don't have to remember 400 passwords and then make them really easy and all the same. The problem with it is that if somebody compromises that one, they've compromised everything. But it reduces those. What type of cryptographic hash function offers the strongest security?
Mutual? Is it mute? No.
It's either SHA or MD5.
SHA.
SHA, because we can have the 256-bit. And let's get it back up here. If we have the MD5, we have a hash that this link, if we go to the SHA-512 and hash it, see how much bigger that is? 512 bits. And it makes it much more difficult to crack passwords. Passwords are typically hashed and sent across networks as hashes. A hash is a one-way function. It's not like an encryption and a decryption. When they use a brute force, what the brute force software does is try to reproduce all of the possible combinations of hashes so that it compares one hash to the other. So the longer, the more secure. What key features are provided by Kerberos? Kerberos, what key features?
Oh, yeah. No, that's not it.
You just have to look at the screen.
Mutual authentication, but I didn't put that down.
So, what key features are provided by Kerberos?
Client, server, and key distribution center.
Those are the parts, but the key features. What's the top here? What advantage? What security advantage does it give us?
The single sign-on is that what we're
Yep. And what's the other one right under?
Okay, mutual authentication. Okay.
Yeah, that. The client and the authentication is usually the machine's authenticating. The client machine authenticates the server, and the server authenticates the client. In Kerberos, the computer actually has a password too. We don't have to worry about it because it changes it itself, but it gets authenticated along with the user. If you back up, and I was trying to think, I think 60 days is the timeout on those. If you use a backup and restore it when you put the client back online, if the password's expired, it can't authenticate. The way you get rid of that is take it out of Active Directory and put it back in Active Directory.
Mm-hmm.
What is a Radius client and how should it be configured?
Radius client they use for wide area networking.
It does, and
it's for wireless access.
Yeah, it can be. It can also be for wired. What it's going to do is control wide area network, and if we have, and a lot of people use this, we have users in, I think on one of my Windows tests it said that you had users in Rome and Ankara and Paris. What protocol would you use to authenticate them? And in that case, you would use Radius, because you can get to it. It can maintain a single database across a wide area. So the client is a device or a server that accepts user connections using the Radius architecture. Client does not need to be able to perform authentication itself. It passes the logon requests to the Radius server to get authenticated. So the device doesn't have the database. The AAA server, the Radius server, has the database with all the user credential information in it. What types of EAP facilitate the secure use of MS Chat for authentication?
The three-way handshake.
Yeah.
The challenging handshake authentication protocol. What is it? The password authentication.
The protected.
Oh.
Protected. Password PAP is say I'll never use it because it's insecure, and it goes in a plain text. What is a pre-shared key? Do you guys use pre-shared keys? Do you have a wireless network?
Group authentication. No, we don't use those though.
You don't.
If we do, I don't know nothing about them.
Yeah. At home, do you have one at home?
No, sir.
No.
No, sir.
On a wireless, the pre-shared key is you share it with everybody, and they type it in when they get onto your wireless. It's not all that secure, maybe for 2 or 3 people, but if you get a dozen people, then it becomes a real issue because you can't keep it secret. Then your secret key is no longer secret. I guess the rest, has everybody else decided not to participate tonight? Tom's turned on, but he's not talking to me.
Just listening.
Okay.
I asked a couple of questions. You didn't hear me.
Yeah, I did. I actually, you probably heard the dog barking in the background. I probably did hear you, but I didn't recognize the voice. What is the minimum security mechanism that an access point must support in order to use enterprise authentication?
WPA Enterprise.
WPA Enterprise. When you get into WPA, you got a WPA Personal and WPA Enterprise, and the Enterprise will support. Yeah, there it is. Will support the EAP. AO2.1x is the one that's typically used for that one. How does ARP inspection security feature of a switch mitigate against ARP flooding? And I don't think I said that when I talked about the switch management. Remember, ARP is an insecure protocol. Will take the answer to a question that wasn't asked, and what the ARP flooding in the switch does is it maintains a database that has the IP to ARP mappings so that it won't accept a false throughput. True or false? The switch implementing 802.1x would be described as an authenticator.
Accessible authenticator, right?
Yeah, it is. The authenticator, what we have is, and this is NAC, trying to find the picture. Yeah, here we go. If it were right here, if we put a switch in instead of a wireless access point, it would be right here, and it would be the authenticator. We have the supplicant, which we normally call the client. I don't know why they changed the words here, but they did. The supplicant, the authenticator, and then the authentication server. And the authentication server is going to be a Radius server. What is meant by remediation in the,
Then?
I'm sorry?
No, that's true then.
It's,
It would be an authenticator.
yeah. The thing that we're trying to connect to, for lack of a better word, is going to be the authenticator. And it's sometimes called the client, to really put the words in, because here they say wireless client, and the word client shouldn't be used here. Should be supplicant. This guy here can be the authenticator or the client, and then the authentication server is the radius server, the thing with the database. What is meant by remediation in the context of NAC, which is the network access control, which is also sometimes called NAP. So what's remediation?
Checking the machine.
After we check the machine, what if it doesn't comply?
Check the security.
Well, we do that, and it didn't comply. It didn't have an antivirus, or it wasn't up to date or something. What do we do then?
Well, it goes off. It's quarantined, or it may go onto the guest.
Quarantined, yeah, and that's where remediation takes place, where we fix what's wrong with it to bring it up to the health standard. But what you said, Tamika, is yes, we check all of that, and then if it's okay, then it goes directly on the network. If something's not been done, something's not running right, or it's not up to date, then it will go into an isolated area for remediation, where it can get the updates or get an antivirus or whatever it was lacking. I know that the labs last night are actually relatively long, and we add one more tonight. Let's get here. 18, and then that's the last one, authentication. So what I'd like to do right now is take about an hour to work on labs, then do the other two, and the one's like 15 minutes. The other two units, and then in the labs. And also, before you check out tonight, please go to in the chat the Metrics That Matter link and do an evaluation. The course is listed as Security Plus. It's really Network Plus, but it's the only one there with my name, so I'm presuming it's the correct one. Questions?
Could you put the link to the recordings and the...
Let's take a few minutes and look at incident response. This is something that can keep a company in business or not keep a company in business. The statistics, and don't count me on the number, but it's if a company doesn't have backups and a business plan and an emergency response plan and those sorts of things, and they get attacked, somewhere around 80 or 90% of them go out of business within a year. So this is something that the book says to give you a mile high, inch deep sort of way. So we'll do a mile high, inch deep sort of way on this one. The objectives: understand the use of a business continuity disaster recovery. And this is going to be something that's planned out. It needs to be a document, and a lot of this stuff needs to be practiced, although sometimes it's difficult to do that because it's very disruptive to restore backups, to simulate disasters and see what happens in them. Understand the importance of end user security awareness and training so that they know what they're supposed to do in an emergency. And emergencies aren't just hacks. It could be flooding, tornadoes, big snowstorms, anything that disrupts or can destroy the system, fire, those sorts of things. Not just somebody hacked the system, although that also is one of them, obviously. Describe the stages and responsibilities of a formal incident response policy. And if you're looking for policy guidelines, SANS.org is a great place to get them for just about any policy you want to write. Describe the characteristics of the forensics investigator and computer systems. So the business impact analysis here is a very important document. It is identifies the critical functions or processes of the business or the organization. It identifies the assets and the resources which the organization depends upon. What we're trying to do here is to identify what we're trying to protect. And if there is a disaster, what order do things need to be restored in? Identify threats to the organization's functions and assets. So these are all things that go into this critical document. And then the last one, assess the risk to each function or asset given the threats. What are the risks? And this is a continuity picture over here, the life cycle of the BCP business continuity plan. We assess what's the impact, strategy selection and the design, plan development, train, test, and maintain, and then go through. And this is a continuing cycle to do these things because situations change. You need to keep assessing what's going on with the plan and to be sure it's still effective. Vulnerability assessments are things that we need to do on our network, on the computers, as well as probably even in the security and the vulnerability. How vulnerable is anything? And it's pen testing is what we're talking about here, and pen testing is ethical hacking. The big difference between an ethical hacker and a non-ethical hacker is the ethical hacker has permissions. If you ever do pen testing, you have to specify in detail what you're going to do to the system. And the client has to tell you what you're allowed to do and whether you're allowed to take the system down or not. And this is going to start out with reconnaissance, active and passive footprinting, where you're going to observe what goes on in the organization. You try to use all sorts of techniques to find out information when we do these things. And then we're going to do scanning, discover port scanning and enumeration. What is open? What's available? Are there what kind of systems on the header dumps? Where I couldn't think of on reconnaissance, we're going to use social engineering to try to find out things. Social engineering can be one of your strongest weapons against somebody you're trying to attack, and that's where it becomes absolutely critical that you have an effective training program so that users aren't prone to giving away things that they shouldn't. And some of the smallest bits of information can be most helpful. Somebody may be only missing the little bitty piece that you give them. These guys are very patient. They take a lot of time to get into organizations. And in scanning, discovery, port scanning, enumeration, we're going to find out what is exposed and see if there are exploits for those things. And the next step that a hacker will use is gaining access, where they crack passwords, social engineering, whatever it takes to get access to the network. And after that, they'll go into and escalate privileges. Then they're going to put a back door in, and that's where scanning your network may come in handy so that you see, why is that port open? What service is that? That's something that I don't have open, or I didn't think I had open. And the access of maintain applications are going to have a backdoor Clearing tracks are going to hide files, and they're going to clear the logs so that you can't see what they did. One of the things, at least in a Microsoft log, the first entry in the new log says who cleared it. So you'll at least have an idea of the user that got on the system. And the pen testing is attack on a live or a test system, however you set it up. The live system is going to give you the best results, but the live system is also going to impact the business. And it can either be either can be disruptive to a production network. Either can be disruptive to a production network. We have vulnerability scanners, and these are softwares configured with a known list of exploits and vulnerabilities. Some of them are very, very expensive. Some of them are open source. So you can find them on the internet. Nessus is one that can be, it's got a community version as well as a pay version, but it is a pretty effective scanner. Well, this really does look for the vulnerabilities, and it'll give you a list of vulnerabilities and possibly the solutions to those. We can have active or passive detection. Passive detection is much like an IDS. Active detection, actually we go out and are noisy. If you do active detection, it bounces the packets at a host and examines the replies. And a passive scanner is like a network intrusion system. So you can have either one of those. There can be either a host OS or a web application where you scan yourself or you scan your entire network. If you're the administrator and you have administrative authority, you're the legitimate scanner. Scanning the network can be useful. You can find out sometimes a lot of things that you needed to know and hope that you wouldn't find when you do these things. The IT contingency planning, not the plan, but when we go through these things in IT, first thing we want to do is try to eliminate as many single points of failures as possible, particularly critical nodes, critical assets, servers, routers, firewalls. And the way we can do that is through redundancy, and we've looked at, briefly at least, some redundant softwares for routers where we had the HSRP and VRRP protocols, hot standby routing protocols, that we had multiples, and then we had the ability to use 2 ports on the switch, and if one went down in port teaming, and if one went down, it could continue to use the system. Or we could have a redundant topology on a switch and use spanning tree, and if the link went down, then spanning tree would reconfigure and provide paths. Battery backups and UPSs are always handy things to have when we do these things. So we want to try to do as much as possible in these things. And routers and switches, we talked about that, they can have multiple paths. But one of the considerations is to have an alternate ISP, that if something happens to your ISP, you have a second way out. It's probably not going to be as efficient as the original because you probably wouldn't buy as much bandwidth. The other way, last way on this list, is clusters. We can cluster servers. When we do that, we have multiple servers doing a single function. And if one of the servers dies, then the other one takes the load. And in this thing over here, we have, it says a cluster interconnect. These things work together. We'll have a cluster management software in here. If these are both active, we could have an active passive. both active. If one of them goes down, the other one will take the load. It may not be as efficient, but it'll take the load. And each of these things in the cluster are connected to get to this shared storage, database in the system. So we have two front ends, a single address to get there, and then the management software will send the packets to the server that is the least busy, that's ready to take the load. Disaster recovery planning is something that we need to do to cope with major incidents. Do we have a tornado that rips up something, maybe our building, or takes down the power? That's one of the things that maybe we don't think about. You've got to think about power losses, water losses. The building's gone. I mean, those are major incidences. And this is the disaster recovery planning is not a server fail and we have to restore a backup. This is you come to work one day and the building's not there, or part of the building's not there. So you've got to do risk and cost assessments. How much is it going to cost? How much do you want to have? And then threat modeling in the system. You have to identify tasks, resources, and responsibilities for the response. We're going to identify who's going to do what, who's responsible for doing what functions are the most critical, what order are we going to restore things, and then you've got to train the staff in disaster recovery and change management. So setting one of these things up is not something that's probably going to be done in an afternoon. It takes time to do these, and once they're done, you need to practice, or at least practice the portions that you can. You may not want to take your entire network down, probably not a good idea, but practice what goes on with these things. We have training, adherence to standards and policies. You don't want to be so inflexible that users are looking to find a way around everything. You want policies that are enforceable, and the enforcement has to have some sort of consequence. You need to do end user awareness training, end user training about the policy, why the policy, the things that we need. And role-based training is not necessarily the job description, but who's actually in that role, who would do that. Response procedures and guidelines. We have different goals, may have different goals, but the end purpose is to reestablish a secure working system, to get the business back up and running, which may take some time. Preservation of evidence of the incident, and now this is with an attack. You don't want to destroy the evidence because you really have to figure out, or try to figure out, what happened. And to do that, we have to have everything that's on the machines, and all of this, we want to prevent the reoccurrence of the incident. If something's happened, we're not going to undo it. What we got to do is figure out how to keep it from happening the next time. The National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, Computer Security Incident Handling Team Guide. There are a number of organizations. NIST is one of them that has lots of documents to help you in the planning of these things. The preparation, what we want to make the systems resilient to attack in the first place, includes hardening the systems, policies, procedures, confidential lines of communication, implies in creating an instant response, resources, and procedures. We need an incident response team for these things too. Detection and analysis to determine whether an incident has taken place and assessing how severe it might be. Did it happen? A lot of organizations that get hacked don't know that they've been hacked for a substantial amount of time. The containment, eradication, and recovery, we want to limit the scope and the magnitude of the incident. The typical response is, well, let's just pull the plug, we'll turn it off. You may not want to do this. Once the incident is contained, the call's been removed, the system brought back up in a secure state, but once it's been contained, you may need to collect evidence. And if you pull the plug, if you shut the system down, you're going to destroy a lot of evidence, like everything that was in memory. A little bit later slide, in the forensics slide, you want to keep the system online. You don't want it to be able to infect anything else, so you may disconnect it from the network. You also don't want other systems to come online because they're going to affect what goes on that machine. You want to image everything. You want to image memory. You want to image the disk. You want to know what the state of all of the different buffers are. The computer incident response team is the first responder, and the first thing that the first responder should do is to secure the area. Different competing objectives. We've got to know what is the loss and what's the potential loss, what countermeasures are available, what evidence can be collected. So how much damage is done? Can it do further damage? Prevent incident isolation. We're going to prevent or interrupt an attack. We're going to allow it to proceed until harm is threatened. If we let it proceed, we may be able to figure out what's going on and help us in prevention the next time. Quarantine and device removal are some of the things that are going to be done with these systems. Once it's isolated, quarantine it, eventually we're going to remove the device and restore the device. If it needs to be, you may have to escalate a notification, and the first responder secure the area. After that, you're going to get the whole team there, and you're going to have a lot of people helping you with the incident. So we're going to handle the incident at a higher level. We're going to escalate it and inform all the affected parties, the suppliers, the customers. If regulatory bodies, law enforcement, you may have to call in law enforcement. You probably are going to call in law enforcement, although many companies won't ever admit to any sort of incidences because of their reputation. You have to inform users if personally identifiable information has been stolen. You may or may not have been, as I said the other day, some of you veterans may have gotten the OPM letter that said your information has been compromised, and go to this website, and they didn't do it very well. Go to this website and log in with this information and set up a monitoring system. When Home Depot was compromised, they didn't send out letters because they didn't know who actually had been compromised. They put a notice on their website that says, if you've been part of this, go sign up, and you can sign up, and then they gave you credit monitoring for a year. Each of the ones that I've been victim of has been for a year. I haven't had any compromises as of yet of any information. The forensic procedures, electronically stored information, ESI. We want to do something in machine readable format. And that's a lot of, sometimes people will want it that way, and a lot of it is going that way. And then we have due process. Due process is a US, UK term. common law to require that people only be convicted of crimes following a fair application of the laws of the land. So we're going to have those things. Legal hold, the information that may be relevant to a court case has got to be preserved. And then e-discovery is when we get the information in machine readable format, computer readable format. There are a number of forensic tools available to you. And back to the Kali Linux, it has a bunch of forensic tools on it. What you don't want to do is destroy any of the evidence. You want to preserve what's there. You collect what is available. I guess we'll go to the collection slide. Gather the emergency response team, and we're going to collect the evidence, capture the live data in the order of volatility. We're going to get the memory first. The most volatile things we want to capture first because they're going to change or they're going to go away. Create image and hash all the information. We looked at hash earlier. If that's so that we create a hash and we can tell if anything's changed after we have created the image, after we hash the image. Then you can hash it again later to see if anybody has changed anything. We're going to document the scene, video, picture, screenshots, record the actions, log and video all the steps that you take. A chain of custody is going to be important. Once you have this thing, you got to put it, you got to know who has handled it, who's had anything to do with any of the information. So we want to gather everything and then be sure that it's handled properly, that anybody that handles it has to sign in the chain of custody. We're going to create the hash to be sure that somebody doesn't change things. And the forensic report does an analysis of the evidence. Again, there are a number of forensic tool kits that are available to us and perform analysis on copies, the images that we've made of both the disk, memory, buffers, everything that we have. Data utilization, data visualization, we talked about. I'm a kind of a visual person, but what we want to do is use one of the tools that give us a visual representation of everything. And the big data one is that you use big data analysis techniques. Big data is large stores of unstructured information. So those techniques are used to do the analysis. And this was the 1,000-foot, 10,000-foot, inch-deep view of this. Understand the use of business continuity, disaster recovery, and IT contingency plans. Understand the importance of end-user security awareness and training, and the end users can make or break you. Describe the stages and responsibilities of formal incident response policy, and describe the characteristics of the forensic investigation computer system. Now the questions. Anybody going to help me out here this time? What document evaluates critical functions, processes, assets against threats to determine the risk?
BCP.
Business impact analysis.
Yep. Business impact analysis. What type of security audit performs active testing of security controls?
Vulnerability assessments.
What? Yeah, exactly.
Vulnerability testing, pen testing, all of those are going to be active, yes. What type of security control provisions, resources, and procedures to cope with major incidences?
For major incidences,
Say which? Give you all sorts of hints by putting a slide up.
Not wearing my glasses.
About the disaster recovery plan. Disaster recovery plans are for major incidences. Then it could be an attack, somebody attacked, stole 100,000 credit cards, or the disaster recovery plan could be a tornado came through and ripped up half the building. They're very exhaustive, and they take a lot of time to actually do. There are different elements of it, and lots of different individuals are going to have inputs to the disaster recovery plan. What technologies can be used to make network infrastructure fault tolerant? I don't think I talked about that one. What can we do to make it fault tolerant? What are some of the things that we've talked about in the course? I'm sorry, I talked over you, Tom.
I talked over you, but that redundancy, alternate routes.
Alternate routes. What about if we have loops, you know, the layer 2, the spanning tree thing, alternate standby routers, clusters, both load sharing and data clusters, adapter teaming, switch routing, backup DNS servers, load balancers. A lot of different devices can help us with fault tolerance. It's going to be expensive to have fault tolerance, so it's going to depend a lot on how important that resource is. How important is it that it have the fault tolerance? And you notice this one kind of mixes the attack with the other stuff, and all of those things are part of disaster recovery. Why should general security awareness training be developed and delivered separately to role-based security training? I don't think I didn't do a good job on all of that. I did a really bad job on this one. But role-based is specific training for your role, and overall is general training. So you need to do both. You need to do the general training, and then for the specific role that the individual has, they need to be trained in that also. How is the person who receives notification of a potential security incident designated?
First responder.
First responder. True or false? Notification of data breaches should never be reported outside the organization.
True.
Really?
False.
You're not going to tell somebody that their credit card got stolen? No, it's false.
Oh.
All of that stuff. And you're probably going to have to get law enforcement involved too, up to the things like the organizations like the FBI.
Well, except for the cover-up.
Yeah.
It took Home Depot a long time to admit it.
It does. It's dangerous to not report it, and now it's illegal except for the government. They don't have to tell you, but everybody else has to tell you immediately. And I've never understood why the government shouldn't do that too, but they're one of the ones that exempted themselves from the law. They always do. A lawyer is demanding that network logs be provided in a computer-readable format. What principle is being invoked here?
Yes,
How about this one? You said ESI. E-discovery is the principle of that electronically stored information is a valid format.
That's the first thing that popped in my head before you popped up this one.
Yeah, you were right.
Was,
We go ahead and do the
Let's do that.
last one because it's only supposed to take about 15 minutes. We'll see if that works or not. And then you can have lab for the rest of the class. If I can figure out where I'm going here. This one's change management. And it's another kind of walk through the woods quickly. But the objectives: understand the role of configuration management policies, procedures, and documentation and network administration. I think we talked about that a little bit, and Tamika talked about it, that people don't want to follow policies, but the policies are established for a reason, and especially the people in the authority, and I agree with her. They typically are the ones that want to be accepted. The policy applies to everybody but me. Understand the proper use of policies and business documents. Ensure effective patch management policies. This is a big deal because patch management, if you don't do it, and some people don't, and one of the slides says only apply the patches that are necessary if the only ones that affect you. That may or may not honestly be a good policy. That's one that you would have to consider. But remember that once the patch comes out, the bad guys, the black hats, are out there reverse engineering it to see what it's fixed. So if you don't apply the patches, you may be leaving vulnerabilities that you didn't know that you had, just simply because you said, oh no, this one didn't do anything for me. Understand the use of backups and archives to support configuration management. Backup is the most thankless job in the world until you need it, and then if you don't have it, you're in trouble. ITIL, or IT Infrastructure Library Configuration and Management Model, as service assets, which are things, processes, people. I didn't want to refer to people as things, but people are an asset that contribute to the delivery of an IT service. A configuration item is an asset that requires specific management procedures for it to be used to deliver the service. Each one must be identified by some sort of a label, so this is something that we can reach out and touch. The configuration management database is where all the configuration items are defined by their attributes, and they're stored there. The baseline we've talked about. The baseline it says it's a fundamental concept in configuration management is the baseline. The baseline represents the way it was. The baseline represents whatever normal was at the time the system was installed. And as we evolve over time, as we increase requirements, resources, the baseline may change, and the baseline can help us determine when we need to have new equipment, to get new equipment. The configuration management system are the tools and databases that collect, store, and manage all of the information about the configuration items. So implementing these things, the move, adds, and changes, sometimes called MACs, are part of the system. What we're going to do with it says that the main difficulty in implementing a workable configuration management system is determining the level of detail that must be preserved, capturing the asset database, but managing what goes on. What are we going to do? When is something when are we going to do one of these moves, adds, or changes? When are we going to make changes? So we have to have procedures for those things. A policy is an overall view of procedures, usually a step-by-step process. The authorization would be the job tickets and the logs, and then we have standard operating procedures to effect what goes on. We want to know what the impact is. Why did somebody want these changes? And then change requests can either be reactive or proactive. We get a change request because something happened. Proactive, we're trying to prevent something from happening. You have to assess what the potential impact of this change is going to be. Change, we got our RFC, which is request for change. The RFC in the protocols are requests for comments. So then we have to have notification and approval, and the change advisory board is going to help with those things. You need rollback procedures when you make changes. The people that worked at big companies, we had a bunch of students that worked at Advance Auto, and they had to do all of their changes, modifications via a script. And when they made the change, they had to have a script that could undo whatever they did, just in case it didn't work. After they tested it and everything, you put it in place and it may not work on the scale that they were working on. Talk about maintenance windows, and they do have maintenance windows. I had a friend who worked at a large IT company, a really large IT company, so they didn't really care when you came to work as long as you did your hours and did your job. And he had a maintenance window. His maintenance window, I think, was like Saturday morning from midnight to 2, that he had to maintain his servers, do all of the update on his servers. And then we need to document all the changes. Document and review what goes on the systems. This is said asset management and vendor documentation. We need network diagrams, physical versus logical, and diagrams can really help bring out what's going on in the system. The image here is actually from the piece of software I think I talked about that sent me all the text messages. What's up? It shows the structure of the network and which systems are working and which systems may not be working. The green ones are up, the red ones are having some issues. Blueprints or specialized drawings, schematics and block diagrams probably do us as much good as anything. And wiring diagrams are the wiring diagrams of the system, and we've kind of talked about those before. They really are important when you start doing troubleshooting. What goes where, because if you don't have that, you're going to have a real difficult time figuring it out. Then we have network mappers, protocols and services running applications, and this is Nmap, and I showed you an Nmap scan last night of a system, and it told me what software was installed, what ports were open, and gave me a little schematic of how far, where it was, where that system was from me, so that I had a network path to get there. Can tell you the workstation and server patch status. Those are a big deal. There are some more expensive, because Nmap's free software will probably do that in a prettier format, but you can find these things. Network address, host names, we looked at all those things, and the one that we looked at said it was a server 2008, was running IS7. We could get a lot of information from these network mappers to help us see what's going on in our network, and if we put on the black hat to help us try to penetrate the network. Network interconnect devices and the status and the security appliances and software. User accounts and groups, especially administrative and root accounts and passwords, if you have enough authority. And I don't think Nmap, although they get the picture of Nmap, but there are other network mappers that will give you that information. If you want to try these out, a lot of them will give you a 30-day trial that's fully functional. And then they try to hard sell you. What I used to tell them was, I was an instructor. I'm just a student. I just wanted to try it out. And I don't have any purchase authority. And that usually helps make them go away. This is what this is the database and the logs is kind of what that's going to look, what that would look like in the system here. And I know that's really hard. It's hard for me to see. Maybe you guys can see it. But it has the device, the device name, its IP address, capabilities, its status, and the last inventory collected. Inventory is a big deal on the network, and you say, oh, that's easy. It's really difficult to get an inventory. What's the machine? What's the processor? How much memory does it have? How much disk space does it have? What's the size of the disk? What programs are on it? Are we sure that there are programs that somebody hasn't put their own programs on, or a pirated program? Procedures and standards, policy standard versus a procedure versus a guidance. A policy is something that how we want people to do things. A procedure is a step-by-step process, and guidance or guidelines that we have there. A standard is a measure by which we evaluate compliance on these things. A procedure is the book says, is an inflexible step-by-step listing, and then the guidance exists for areas of policy where there are no procedures. Standard operating procedures are critical tasks that have those. This is what the standard that we use. A management plan for servers and devices, it says central plank in ensuring a secure, efficient, well-managed. We need to have a plan how we're going to manage these things, how we're going to update them, how we're going to make them bastion hosts, how we're going to be sure that we don't have unnecessary services running on, because remember, the services running on this thing is what's going to open up ports. And once you open up ports, you have created a vulnerability, maybe. The standard business documents, a memorandum of understanding, usually a first step, a preliminary step in coming in or an exploratory agreement with another organization with intent to work. The statement of work is what you're actually going to do, and you need to be sure that it is complete, and then when the job's done, you need to be sure that all of the work was done. A service level agreement is usually with an ISP for what kind of services that you buy, the metrics that you're going to use to measure to be sure that you're getting what you paid for. And a master service agreement is a master contract governing subcontracts, and they may be written as statements of work. Key performance indicators, availability and uptime versus downtime, and how are we doing on these things. Planned versus unplanned outages. We can have planned outages, and that's what our maintenance periods are going to be. Response time, how long does it take to a measure of the mean time taken to acknowledge a support request, not to fix it, but to acknowledge it. The uptime availability, you've heard of the 5 nines, And this would be the 5 nines here, 99.99% of the time up, which means that the annual over the course of a year, you have 5 minutes and 15 seconds of downtime. 99.99, 52 minutes down, and those things. 99%, 87 hours and 36 minutes of downtime. So when a company claims the 5 nines, they have a very high uptime. I've never understood, maybe 87 hours. DirecTV talks about 87% uptime. That means that they can be down 87 hours a year, and it depends on which 87 hours if you're watching whether it means anything to you or not. The mean time to failure is how long we expect it to be, the expected lifetime of a product or a system, and the mean time between failure is how often it fails. The mean time to repair, how long it took to fix it, and the mean time between service incidences is how much time between a point of failure of the system and its next point of failure. Employee policies that we have as acceptable use policies. What can users do on our networks? And many people expect to just be given free rein. That may or may not be the case. The issue becomes if somebody uses the company equipment to threaten somebody, for instance, then the company can become liable. So you have to be really careful what people can and can't do. You really do have to be careful what they can and can't do on your network. So we have to establish a acceptable use policy. A network policy is how is similar to the acceptable use policy. Can we use the social networking and those sorts of things? What are the network policies? Some of the other policies, in my thinking, security policies are going to be, when you how long if you have to change passwords, how long do the passwords have to be? How you're going to configure the computers, a number of different things. Can we use personally owned devices? And again, that is become I think a big issue. And are you going to allow those on your network, keeping in mind that they can you don't have any real control over these devices. They belong to somebody else. You can't force them to put take any preventive measures at all, and you can't check them as they go. And the other things, you can allow people to plug in flash drives to the machine and copy information. It's a great way to get a lot of information out of a company quickly. Privacy policy and consent to monitoring. What is the privacy policy? Generally, when you use the company's equipment, you can be monitored. And the monitoring, physical and video surveillance, what kind of monitoring are you going to do? Monitoring data, analyze the communications. What about the phone system? Are you allowed to use the phone system to make personal calls? Are you allowed to use the computer equipment in order to check your personal email? Personal email, big deal right now, I guess, because of what's going on in the presidential race. And then patch management, update policies. How are we going to update these things? In a large network, one of the things that you need to consider is, will the updates break your specialized software? And that may or may not be the case. The picture over here, this is a picture of the console of a Microsoft software update services. What it does in an enterprise is the WSUS server goes out to Microsoft and gets the update. It then distributes the updates that the network administrator approves to the systems inside the network. That means that you can check these things in your lab before you distribute them to all of your computers on the network. Firmware and driver updates, all of these things, we need to pay attention to. The driver software, if it gets updated and it breaks something, you can always roll the driver back. And then firmware updates, we need to do those. Feature changes and updates. If we have feature changes, you may have to do some training with the users when we do those things. Major versus minor updates, those, what impact again does it have on the system? And then upgrading versus downgrading configuration backup, we want to make backups of the configurations as we do these things. And then the last one is backups and archives. Backup is a security copy. An archive is when something is moved to long-term storage. You no longer need rapid access to it. And a backup says it's a security copy. We make a backup so that if something happens to the original, we can get it back and restore it. It's one of the things that most of us don't do well on our own machines, and you, I, and everybody need to consider what we're doing with backups or not doing with backups. The retention policy, the short-term copies for the version rollback, and that's if we make a change we really didn't mean to and we saved it inadvertently with some changes that shouldn't have been there. We have versioning in Windows that we can do a rollback and roll it back to a previous version of a document. Then long-term retention, probably going to be papers stored someplace. How long do you need the records? Where are you going to need the records? How are you going to do that? Because they'll just keep building. You've got to make a decision as to when things are going to go away. A recovery window is how long do we need to be able to recover this stuff? And then the recovery point objective is determined through the business continuity plan. The recovery window is determined by the recovery point objective. The recovery window, how long do we want it to be available for recovery? And a back out contingency planning. Another reason is to support the back out contingency plan are most closely associated with rolling back OS updates. If we do put them on and we have a problem, we've got to get it back. Some of them, and WSUS will tell you that whether you can remove the patches or not, and Microsoft will tell you that if you read about them. Once you put it on, can you take it off if you need to do that? You need to know those things. If we're using virtual machines, we can make them go back relatively easily by using snapshots. If we're using physical machines, maybe not so much. You need to be sure that the patch is going to do what you need it to do, and it's not going to destroy things that you don't need it to destroy. I think that's the last slide. So the review is understand the role and configuration, management policies, procedures, and documentation in network administration. Understand the proper use and policies of business documents. Ensure effective patch management policies, and understand the use of backups, archives, and support management. So we have some questions. What types of baseline are useful when performing configuration management?
Configuration and performance.
Yep. It records the baseline record. The problem with baselining is we keep using, or I do anyway, keep using the word baseline in the definition of it, and that does not work out well. So I wind up using the word to define itself. In terms of day-to-day tasks, what demonstrates that effective configuration management procedures take place?
Determining the details. What you gonna make changes on?
What you're going to make changes on, the logs, procedures, standard procedures, troubleshooting work, all those things that you're talking about, what we did. What type of software could you use to determine IP address utilization? Which IP addresses are being used?
Then that
Say that again.
ZenMap.
Nmap, yeah, network mappers. That's one of the network mappers, but yes. What's the difference between a physical and logical schematics? What's a physical topology?
Connectivity.
It's what you actually,
Physical connectivity.
it's what you see. What's the logical one?
How the data flows.
The logical is the electrical flow, yeah. You're analyzing a network schematic and notice the following icon which you can't see. What does it represent? And what it's supposed to represent a router. And there is a, let me see if I can find it. There's, and they say that the Cisco icons are generally accepted. And on page 431 is a table of icons, and those are the Cisco icons. Sure looks like it. I think those are the Cisco icons. So those are what you'll see on drawings, and when they do simulations on tests, that's what you're going to see also, so that you can recognize what they look like. How might MSA and SOW be used together? MSA, Master Service Agreement, and SOW, Statement of Work.
Do with the SLAs or not.
Yeah, you want me to do this one? They've got a lot of words in this one. The MSA will set out standard terms applicable to multiple contracts, such as payment terms, confidentiality agreements, dispute resolutions, and it would. The Master Service Agreement is going to apply to all of the contracts. Given those standard terms, a statement of work would set out the tasks and deliverables for a specific project.